Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tech in EdTech. Today, we have with us Paul Grudnitski. I've known Paul for a while now. I consider him a big voice of influence in the space of assessments, learning, personalized learning, anything to do with QTI standards. Very happy to have you on the show, Paul. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks, Paul. So, Paul is currently the CEO and founder of MPUP.io. And Paul has worked in various different roles in the past. But before we get into the agenda of the show today, Paul, why don't you introduce yourself, give the audience a little background about you and what you do?
Sure. Well, like many of our listeners, I suspect, my journey has taken quite a few twists and turns. But, as a founder of my current company, MPUP.io, which is involved in building formative assessment technology specifically targeted at educators or for educators. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this was because 2 decades ago, I was involved in a startup company called Lesson Lab, which was focused on improving instruction, particularly K-12 instruction. And so Lesson Lab was participating in the Third International Math and Science Study, and I got a chance to do a deep dive into instruction and how instruction varies not only across the United States, but across the world. And while I was there, we built an assessment platform to help further the mission of the company for improving instruction. And I did that for a while. And then I was invited to go and be the chief architect at Pearson in the state and national assessments business. So these are accountability assessments, which are very different than formative assessments. But in that world, in the world of accountability assessments, I really had a chance to work with some very talented people. Just the world of accountability assessments is very demanding, and from a performance standpoint, from a security standpoint. And I learned a lot while I was doing my job as chief architect. And I did that for about 9 years. And then when I decided to leave, I kind of wanted to return back to this world of instruction and improving instruction, and how assessment meets up with curriculum and instruction, and how we might combine all these ingredients into something that can be really special. And ultimately, what we really want to do in our world is improve learner outcomes. And so that's what I'm all about today. And that's what we're doing at MPUP.io. And that's why I was very interested in this topic that we have today for assessments for personalized learning and instruction.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for that. I mean, you've had an amazing journey. And, one of the things that I've noted is that you've been in the assessment space longer than many other people that I know. And your focus on this area and the way you spoke about how assessment impacts other pieces of learning and instruction is very fascinating. So we'll go into some details over there. But before we do that, wanted to understand, because assessments can also mean, like in some cases, examination, testing. Why don't we start by saying, okay, what do we mean by assessment? And then you spoke about different types like accountability assessment, formative assessments. Why do you want to give some color to some of these terminologies?
Sure. So, when we talk about assessment, I've already mentioned, the term accountability assessment, or sometimes we call these standardized assessments, versus more formative assessments. And there's also balanced assessments, all kinds of assessments. But the main distinction when we talk about formative assessments versus accountability assessments is, so accountability assessments are standardized and calibrated, and they're meant to be more of a summative measure. And formative assessments are, in my view, are the kind of thing that educators do all the time, whether they realize it or not. They are measuring students. And what I mean by that is when a teacher is delivering a lesson, before they deliver that lesson, they usually have a game plan, sometimes known as a lesson plan. And the first thing you need to do is you need to measure where the student is in their understanding of a concept or a skill. So
Right.
that in itself is a formative assessment. We measure first, and then we proceed to instruct. And hopefully we personalize the instruction according to the specific gap or gaps in student understanding. And so if we didn't do that, then everybody would basically every student would get the same instruction. And when you have 20 to 30 students in a class, that's not going to be a very useful experience for quite a large number of those students. So anyway, we measure first, and then we deliver a lesson or a part of a lesson. And then we are constantly, the good educators are measuring over and over and over again. They're always sort of like taking temperature. Is the student following? Who is not following? Who's got the glazed eye look? Who's locked in? And so this happens over and over. And these are what we really are calling formative assessments or formative measurements. And now we can provide all kinds of technology solutions to help scale those kinds of measurements out and make them quite effective and personalized.
I love that. Love that explanation. I'll tell you what, the concept of formative assessment is so new to me. I'll be very honest, because I think growing up, the education system that I studied in, and now that's changing, but we only knew the concept of assessments at the end of your learning journey, and as a way for you to go ahead somewhere, like it's exam, it's assessment. Right. I don't think we focused on formative assessments at all. I wish we had, but
right. Well, you might not have, but trust me, your teachers were, and whether they called them formative or not, they're always measuring to see, especially the good ones. I mean, everybody, there are some educators who are just going to follow the lesson plan, and there's no twists and turns in the plan. It's just marshaling the kids through a lesson. But the good educators are constantly they're measuring, they're getting data all along the way, and they're trying, because they know where the misconceptions are in these lessons, and so they're trying to identify which students are falling into the misconception trap or which ones are getting it, and so they've got to measure in order to do that.
Absolutely. And now that you think about it, one way of formative assessment I remember was a teacher asking in classroom, okay, so tell me what is the spelling of this, who can tell me? And I raise hand. That's formative assessment without technology. But I would say that's formative assessment. That's teacher is gathering data on student understanding. Yeah. You're right about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Even in sort of like higher ed, there's, you have let's say a lecturer. And then you have let's say you have a classroom of, say, 100 students. And so the lecturer makes a point, and then they, sometimes the students are supplied with these little clickers. And so the student, the lecturer might ask a question and then ask the students to click yes or no whether they've answered the question. And so the lecturer can look on the screen and see, how the different students have responded, which responses are getting the biggest percentage. So those are formative measurements. And so they're, if students are not understanding, then they'll reinforce the skill or the part of the lesson that they just covered.
So Paul, I think that is amazing. The biggest value, in my opinion, of this formative assessment is its role in personalized learning. Because if I get that input that, okay, this is what my class is at right now, that will help me personalize the instruction. So we want to talk about how that all plays out.
Sure. So in terms of personalizing instruction and learning, formative assessment plays a crucial, almost an essential part in this. And many of these ideas about how to deliver a lesson, what, which students are following, what to teach next, and that sort of thing. All these concepts were kind of laid out sort of formally by a very famous educator named Madeline Hunter in her famous book, Mastery Teaching. And she introduced this notion that all teaching decisions can really be placed into three categories. So when we're making a teaching decision, an educator has to ask, what content do I teach next to my student or to my class? And again, in order to determine that, you need to assess, you need to measure where the student is. Another important decision that has to be made by the educator is, what will the student do to learn or to demonstrate that learning has occurred? And obviously, that's another kind of measurement. That's another formative measurement. And then the last thing that Madeline Hunter laid out, the last concept, is, what is the educator going to do to facilitate the acquisition of learning? So, we can measure, we can teach, we can measure again to see if the student can demonstrate that they've mastered a concept. And if the student has not demonstrated suitable mastery, then what is the educator going to do next? What will they do to facilitate? What resources will they bring to bear in order to help facilitate further learning and mastery? And so all three of these points, all three of these notions in mastery teaching are facilitated by assessment and formative assessments. The fundamental truth is, you cannot personalize instruction or learning without measuring first, and then you have to continue to measure in the middle, at the end, and you then personalize the instruction accordingly. So fundamentally, personalized learning and instruction cannot happen without assessment, early and often.
All these concepts are so powerful, and this is, by the way, this is the first time that I've heard about them. And just when you were speaking, I was obviously imagining my learning journey. So I think that is really insightful, and I would definitely want to read this book. And I'll obviously, for the audience, I'll put the link in the show notes. But I think that gives a very good idea of, even when you formulate assessments, how is that going to facilitate the next steps in the learning journey. So I think that was a great thing.
Madeline Hunter, she was an educator at UCLA, and for decades, even today, her work and mastery teaching, it's very influential. Sometimes, there's always criticisms and folks who are critical of mastery teaching, and it's not for everybody. But anyway, it's very influential, and I would say, at least in the United States, most educators, whether they know it or not, are probably teaching a lot from the mastery teaching playbook.
Yep, and just being completely honest, I learned about mastery learning like a few years back. That's when I actually, because sometimes these terms get thrown around, mastery learning, but without us grasping the core understanding of it. So I got to know about mastery learning just like a few years back, and I'm not getting to know about mastery teaching today. So thank you for that. Talking about terms being thrown around, one of the terms that gets thrown around a lot in assessment space is adaptive assessment. Now at the core, at the core of it, we know that the instruction, like, it adapts to your responses. But why don't we talk a bit about adaptive assessment? Paul, feel free to go into as much detail as you'd like to. But let's talk about adaptive assessment and how that applies in all the scenarios.
Adaptive assessment, of course, is it's almost thrown around so much that nobody even knows what we're talking about anymore. But I like to break adaptive assessment. I like to break it down into three main buckets, and there are probably more. When we talk about adaptive assessment, we might be talking about what we call computer adaptive assessment, where we have collection of items, and then we are computing an ability estimate. So that's in sort of nerdy assessment vernacular. We are computing an ongoing ability estimate. So if the student gets something right, and depending on how the item is calibrated, then the student's ability estimate goes up. And of course, if they get the question wrong, it typically goes down. And And then within that assessment, we might be giving harder or easier items or skipping topics altogether, depending on the ability estimate. And then we also have this notion of what's called staged adaptive assessment. In staged adaptive, what we have is really a sequence of linear tests. And as you complete each test, you have an ability estimate. And then based on that ability estimate, you have you're provided a more difficult linear test or an easier linear test. So we have these collections of items where the item sequence is not being adapted within that collection of items, but we are jumping you to a harder test or to an easier test, and that's staged adaptive. And then the last thing that is getting a lot of, especially I would say my attention lately, is this notion of adaptive items. So in an adaptive item, not a test, an adaptive item, what we're doing is we're presenting an item to a student, and then as the student begins to answer those one part of the item, we're using that response, scoring it, and then presenting perhaps a different branch within the same item. So we can almost like these adaptive items literally adapt in front of the screen based upon how the student is answering the item itself. So that's an adaptive assessment within the context of a single item. So these adaptive items are particularly useful in formative settings because we can almost create some we can create some very interesting learning experiences within these adaptive items. And that's the focus of a lot of work that we're doing at AMP-UP.io. With these adaptive items, what we're able to produce is almost a unit of assessment that's almost that can be rethought of as a learning object. So as the student begins to answer the first or second part of a question, the item itself can adapt and provide a hint or different kinds of hints. And so anyway, this is all very interesting, and it sort of leads into ways that we can begin to scale out a personalized learning and instruction environment or an ecosystem.
Yeah, that's very, very, very intriguing. And the computer adaptive assessment, I've taken that. I really have liked it because I think one of the things I believe, I'm just taking a step back here. One of the things that I believe assessments help do is they make learning more engaging as well. Because as a student, get to see my progress on a regular basis. And I see assessment as a very good tool for making learning engaging. I know a lot of times the connotation of assessment is with testing you, checking your progress, but it also is very strongly associated with engaging you. So anyway, so the point that I was saying is the computer adaptive assessment, I find it personally very engaging because it really gets my interest and it matches to my caliber or my abilities and competence.
Yes, well, that's the general idea is to if we can properly compute an ability estimate that shows that you've mastered something, then why continue to measure? And maybe it's time to go on to a more advanced topic. And so strong learners, tend to prefer computer adaptive assessments because they're more interesting, as to your point.
Right. So, Paul, we've spoken a lot about the state of assessments today, the different types of assessment. I want to turn towards the future now. What do you see? What do you see the future of technology, and also move towards how can technology enable, and what is the future of these assessments, and how can technology basically play a big role here?
Sure. Well, with our topic today is personalized learning and instruction with assessment, formative assessment, and when you think about personalized learning, I mean, this is the holy grail. This is what, if every one of us had a tutor in every subject that they encountered in school, I would bet you that those students would have more achievement, demonstrate more achievement than those who did not. And so with technology today, we can begin to connect the dots, take all these different ingredients of curriculum, instruction, assessment, and begin, especially with standards, we can begin to wire together an ecosystem and do some amazing things at tremendous scale. Like when I was at Pearson, we were, on Thursdays on U.S. Eastern Standard Time, we were delivering and scoring 25,000 items per second with the technology that we had built. So not just delivering them, but scoring the responses. So 25,000 per second. And it cost us like pennies to do that. So now with this technology and with standards, and by being able to wire together these sorts of these technologies, we can begin to imagine a future where all of this stuff just starts to work, and we can do so for pennies on the dollar.
That's that's so fascinating to hear. The scale, just amazing.
Well, not just that, but another thing that's really plays an important part in scaling out these experiences is the adoption and adherence to standards. So there are there's all kinds of innovations going on out in the ed tech ecosystem, and I certainly salute and commend the folks that are doing all these innovations. But when the innovations are outside of they're not standards based, then they're really one-off. They're really custom solutions. So now with the emergence of some very important standards in the ed tech ecosystem, we can begin to start to do some of this and scale these things out at quite low cost. And I actually have a couple of really interesting examples of this so Pearson had a product, and I think they still do have something called Right to Learn. And this is a product that is really an assessment product, but it's focused on helping students improve their writing. And so there's all kinds of different prompts, writing for information, writing for narrative, that sort of thing. And so a student is given a prompt. The technology, which is standards-based, takes that student response, an essay or the writing sample that the student provided, and AI scores it with standards-based technology, produces not just an overall score for that, but also the subclaims that go along or match up with the Common Core subclaims, like word complexity or plagiarism and things of that nature. So the student is provided a scoring rubric that shows how the student did on each of the 6 subdimensions of the overall score. But it goes even further by providing sample writing that shows, okay, here's your here's your word complexity, and here's what the next level of word complexity might look like for this kind of writing prompt. So it not only shows you, it not only measures you, but it shows you kind of like where you are and what the next level of word complexity looks like, or what the next part of the subclaim scoring of the score that the right to learn provided back to the student. So, with this kind of thing, this kind of technology, I can remember being in a room with an educator who was a high school educator, and she had 127 students across the 5 periods or whatever. And with this Right to Learn, all of a sudden it occurred to her that, she wouldn't she could just give students this tool, and it would auto score. So she wouldn't have to score like 127 essays a day. And that was like life changing. This educator got emotional when she realized that her life was going to change just by using this tool that was all standards based, but wired together to do assessment, but then also instruction.
That's the value of technology, right?
That
that's amazing.
Touched on it a little bit, is this notion of adaptive items, standards. So in the assessment world, there's all, I would call them different kinds of terms for adaptive items, but there's an assessment standard out there called QTI, and this is a shameless plug, I guess, for QTI, but I was formerly one of the co-chairs of the QTI assessment standard.
Let me pause again.
When I was at Pearson, and I would just make the distinction of standards-based adaptive items versus custom adaptive items. And with standardized adaptive items with QTI, we can begin to wire together some very interesting experiences, almost like we can take an assessment item that's literally built with an assessment standard, but build it in such a way that it creates almost like a learning object. And I know that there are educational publishers who are working right now that have like somewhere in the neighborhood of 140,000 of these QTI assessment items that are adaptive items, and they're building them with this new standard called QTI 3. And I think they expect to have those items ready in the next year or two. And these items support, especially in math, support some very helpful and useful experiences to improve student achievement and student outcomes in the realm of mathematics. So, again, with standards or standards-based technology, we can really start to make the sort of ed tech ecosystem. We can start to scale it up at very low cost.
Paul, that's really a great example. And to imagine that kind of scale today, teachers would love it. The fact that you made, it can be emotional given the kind of burden, given the kind of time that teachers spend on these activities. I think that can really be extremely powerful. So that's a great example.
Well, that's what we should be able to do. That's what great software can do if it's got the right mix of technology and also it needs content. Without the right content and without it being wired together properly, the technology can't really do anything with it. But when things are lined up, you can create some amazing experiences. Another example, especially talking to the point about standards-based assessment content is, and I alluded to it earlier with this notion of adaptive items, is with standards-based adaptive items, and using in particular this QTI, this assessment standard called Question and Test Interoperability, QTI adaptive items. We can now create these experiences where a student begins to answer one part of the question, the first part of the question, or the second part of the question in a certain way, and the item begins to adapt. And again, it's using standardized content. So that means that these items can be sort of like thought of as learning objects instead of just assessment items. They can be reimagined as something completely different. And all because they're standards-based, they can be, what we say in the technology world, the content can travel. So you're not necessarily locked into one proprietary standard or a proprietary assessment player, or a curriculum or an LMS. You can your content can travel to other LMSs or into other environments, and students can still get experience these amazing kinds of learning experiences. And so that's the real opportunity that we have in front of us in educational technology, is not just having great content, but great technology that's standards based, and so we can begin to scale things out.
Right. I'm a huge. I think the standards is huge, and as you correctly said, right. If you're doing something in silo, that's a custom development, and the impact is limited. So I think adopting standards and leveraging that to scale something up is definitely very, very powerful.
Right. Without standards, we really can't scale things very much. Proprietary stuff might be great in one environment, but it's completely dysfunctional in another environment, and that limits scalability and mass appeal and the economics of it all.
What are some of the things that you would want to happen in the future with using technology? Like, these are some of the things that you mentioned that that's where you see things going. What are some of the things that you want to happen, that you think that we should work towards as an industry, that we should work towards solving those big problems? What are some of those?
Well, one of the things that really interests me the most, and I think it interests a lot of folks as well, especially in the curriculum and instructional community, is going back to Madeline Hunter's book Mastery Teaching. She talks about this idea that student mastery is not really it's not a yes or a no thing. It's really there's a spectrum. It's about probabilities. For example, just because a student gets a question or an item correct, that could mean that they've mastered the concept or the skill. But there's lots of reasons why students get items right or wrong. So sometimes they guess. Sometimes the item is written poorly, and the item is actually inversely predictive. So what Madeline Hunter talked about is that when we're dealing with humans, students, and when an educator delivers a lesson, we hope that the probability of student understanding will be increased, but it's not guaranteed. So one of the exciting things that especially in formative assessment that's kind of gaining a little bit of strength is this notion of cognitive diagnostic modeling. And it's unlike standard IRT or item response theory. What we're doing here is calculating a probability that a student has mastered a skill or a standard, but most likely a skill. And so with technology, we can begin to compute these probabilities very rapidly. And again, that sort of helps us accelerate this movement to more personalized learning and instruction. So student answers a collection of questions. We compute mastery probabilities, maybe using some kind of machine learning technology like a Bayesian network. And then we can begin to make good judgments about what kinds of interventions we might want to make, or also about what is the probability that the student has mastered the skill. There's a lot of work going on in this area. I can't really comment on the specific folks that are doing the work, but let's just say that there are educational publishers who are adopting these notions of cognitive diagnostic modeling, computing probabilities of student or skill mastery, and then using those probabilities as a way to inform further instruction, inform types of remediation, what kinds of learning objects would be most appropriate for the gap in student understanding that's shown by a mastery probability. So that's pretty exciting, and that's I think I know of some educational publishers that either are already have already moved in that direction, or are planning to.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I think this the entire what this COVID did was the learning loss, that conversation around unfinished learning and learning loss, I think there are some elements of this technology that can help with those areas of narrowing those gaps, making sure that that those areas are taken care of more effectively than what we have right now. So I think that's very fascinating. That's very interesting.
Well, and that's and it's also important to recognize the role of formative and skills based assessment in this, as opposed to standards based assessment. So, like in accountability or summative assessments, we're always measuring standards. Well, in the real world, for educators, they don't teach to standards. I mean, they shouldn't be. They are teaching to skills. That's what the entire curriculum is based on. So, in math, there might be 5,000 skills that a student might master from grades K through 12. So, the skills learning progression for math is very fine grained, and our current standards just can't, they're very there's only 40 standards at each grade level in math. So, it's just not enough to really be of something useful to an educator or to a student in terms of skills mastery probability. So anyway, Bayesian networks, cognitive diagnostic modeling can really help fuel personalized learning and instruction at scale.
So I think that's a definite area where there's a lot of promise. Just at a high level, if we have to think about some of those big ideas or moonshots, as I would like to call it, one of the things that you spoke about in your, I think you mentioned that tutoring at scale, that really caught my attention, because I think tutoring is these days it's there. I think districts are investing in tutoring, but that's one-on-one tutoring. But you spoke about tutoring at scale, and then the personalized instruction and learning at scale. What do you think about that concept, or how do you think about that happening?
Well, so yeah, I mean, this is the holy grail. This is what we should be able to do. We should be able to build an ecosystem that delivers really effective instruction, curriculum, assessment, remediation, support, all the way through. And it's not going to be, it's not easy, or else somebody would have done it. But I think we have the technology available today. We need some of the ingredients, and we need the right entities the right organizations out there to make some of it happen. And I think the rewards will be significant for both the learners, the educators, and of course let's call it the vendors who are out there doing it. I mean, what do they need to do? Well, it's no easy matter. I mean, we need curriculum. We probably need this to come from an educational publisher. We need assessment content that's connected to the skills or learning progressions of the curriculum. We need machine learning know-how. We need the right learning progressions. I mean, somebody has to make these learning progressions up, and then we need learning objects that can be used by automatically. That can be delivered to the student automatically. So if I have a gap in student understanding, if I'm a student and I don't understand something about fractions, I need to get exactly the right kind of remediation material, not just some generic thing about fractions. I need to know, like, if I'm having a problem with adding fractions with common denominators, and I get a remediation material or a learning object that helps that exercises my student understanding of adding fractions of uncommon with common denominators, then that's an incoherent sort of learning object. So ultimately, what we need is coherence through the whole tech stack, through the whole content stack, through the whole skills progression stack. So it's a monstrous job, but man, we ought to be. I know we can do it. I know we can. Today, I know we can do it. It's really about willpower.
Yep. And this is an area where I'm very passionate about because scale directly impacts affordability and access. So the role of one of the biggest role of technology is to make learning available to all, and to make the right kind of learning available to others. And I think this is an area where we can use technology to get us there. So yeah, that's a very passionate thing. A very,
Well,
I can see that passion coming from you as well.
well, that and it's not just technology, but you have to have the right content too.
Right.
It's when I was at Lesson Lab, and I was in a room once with a group of 20 educators. They were math instructors at LA Unified School District, and we were going over a simple problem. It was like 57 times 26, and in that room of 20 educators, there were no less than 4 solution methods for that particular problem. What is the procedure for solving that problem? There were 4 different ones that were used by those 20 educators. So one of the problems we have is that, especially in math, is that if you have a curriculum, you probably have a point of view on a solution method. And if your learning object, or if you're, even though we know that you are lacking in a particular skill, but your learning object that's prescribed to you teaches a different solution method than the one that the instructor is using in the classroom, then that is not going to be effective. So again, what we need here, and the real opportunity, is coherence through not just the technology, but how things are wired together. The look and feel of certain things, the solution, the procedures that are used, the point of view has to be all connected. One system, I'm not really familiar with it all that much, but I hear a lot of good things about how coherent it is the system. It's called Alex. So in math, I think they're doing a really nice job.
I think it's McGraw-Hill. I think it's McGraw-Hill.
That's the sort of thing where what I'm trying to say is we need content and technology and the skills progression and the machine learning magic to all line up. But it's doable. It's doable, and we're seeing some examples of it even today.
Yep, I believe that's a North Star, right? That's something that we should be looking towards to get there. So, no, I think this has been really, really helpful, Paul. Thank you so much for all the information, for all the knowledge on assessments. Like, I think we uncovered so many layers today, that it's amazing to get that kind of detail. As we wrap this up, what are the things that you would want to share with your fellow, folks in the industry, your colleagues, your peers? What are the things that you would want to share, or advice that you would like to give to the audience?
Well, we don't have that much time, but if
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm very interested in is, so it's going back to standards and sort of a lack of coherence. One of the things I've observed is that we have a standard. It's a publishing standard called Common Cartridge, and in this standard, this is the standard format through which educational publishers deliver instructional content and assessment. And it strikes me that Common Cartridge is 20 years old, maybe more. And one of the things that it's clearly lacking is that there's no way within Common Cartridge to evaluate, score, branch, adapt, or personalize within a page or within a collection of pages or between pages. There's no evaluation. There's no measurement within a Common Cartridge or a course page. And so it just strikes me that that it's going to be very difficult to scale out personalized curriculum and instruction without having a Common Cartridge standard that gets updated with some key ways to seamlessly integrate adaptivity and personalization and scoring and evaluation within a page or between pages. So if anybody's out there who's interested in making Common Cartridge sort of like aligned with this topic of personalized instruction, curriculum, and learning, then I would say get involved in the standards body, the One Ed Tech standards body, and the Common Cartridge standard itself. And then I would also say be an advocate for changes to the standard. Without being an advocate, the educational, let's say the LMS providers are not going to do anything. They're just going to sit tight unless they get struck by lightning and some crazy leadership changes happen. So be an advocate and get involved, especially in Common Cartridge, if you really believe in advocating for personalized learning and instruction at scale. It seems to me without the LMS support, it's going to be a tough way to go, or we'll just be in our custom silos just like we are today.
Yep. And that's be an advocate and get involved. I think that's an apt ending to this. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. And I really appreciate you sharing these insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks.